First of all, Vince, can you just tell us a bit about how the past 3 or 4 months have been? What have you been what have you been up to, and how have you kept yourself occupied?
Well, I suppose it sounds a little irreverent, but would, I think I'm having what would be called a good lockdown. I've disappeared to my wife's little cottage in the New Forest, which is absolutely idyllic. So lots of walking, cycling, and between times writing my weekly column for the Independent, writing books, finishing one, starting another. So if you had to design an ideal lockdown, I think I've probably found it.
Good, good. What have you made of the government's handling of the coronavirus?
Um, well, I don't want to be too partisan and score political points. I think they have been to some extent let down by the plethora and conflicting scientific advice they've been getting. But even that said, the execution has been poor, and there were some particularly awful incidents like the way in which Dominic Cummings was dealt with over his breach of the rules, which, I mean, it wasn't just the individual doing something silly, it was that it forfeited an enormous amount of trust and goodwill, and that did a lot of damage. And there were some specific mistakes, around the lack of ordering of equipment, the discharging of infected people into old folks' homes, the confusion over test and trace, the confusion over masks. Now, in each case, it wasn't clear where the fault lay, whether it was the advice or the politicians or a bit of each. But I think, Britain is very much in the kind of lower end of countries in terms of their response, with Germany, Korea, Taiwan at the top.
So we'll talk a bit about your life. So you grew up in York, and your family was a working class conservative family, I believe.
Yes, they were kind of socially mobile. I mean, it was my mother and father started out as factory workers, but they were ambitious and progressed through professional jobs, home ownership. It was about getting on and doing well and working hard and saving and all those virtues. And that was the environment I was brought up in.
And you were a Labour Party member in 1966. So what was it that drew you to liberalism in the end?
Well, actually, I never saw a clear demarcation between the Liberals, as they then were, and the kind of Social Democrats of the Labour Party. I mean, you could manufacture differences, and the issue is there today, actually. But there was a lot of overlap. So I supported the Liberals when I was actually a student at Cambridge, mainly because I was attracted by their then leader, Joe Grimmond, who had been the first person really to make the case for Britain joining the European Union. The Labour Party were shilly-shallying on the subject. But once that break had been made with the past and we confronted the election in 64, 66, it seemed to me that, the Labour Party, then led by Harold Wilson, seemed a perfectly plausible and attractive alternative, and I supported them.
And who were your political inspirations growing up, and what led you into politics?
Oh, I think a mixture of things. I mean, I was a sort of curious student. I was interested in political issues. Certainly at that level, I think my involvement wasn't terribly deep. I mean, I was, interested in the issues and cared about them, but it wasn't based on any detailed personal experience. I think later on, when I'd left university, gone off to live and work in Kenya, and got married, there were one or two issues which supercharged my interest. I mean, one of which was the whole racism issue. I, married into an Asian family and sort of saw firsthand some of the problems that people experienced. And after living in East Africa, I went to live in Glasgow and got involved in city politics. And there were, issues around urban poverty, appalling housing that I'd never seen before. York was not an extreme city in the way that Glasgow was. And so I got drawn into sort of community campaigning and got much more emotionally engaged in politics than I had been as a student.
And what did your student years look like? Did you spend a lot of time in the library, or were you out there debating?
Well, I sort of fell between various stools, actually. I think the people who do well as students are single-minded. They go there, I'm going to get a first, or I'm going to get a blue, or whatever. And I want to do a bit of everything. I was chasing women, doing sports, doing acting in the union, trying to do natural science part one tripos, which was quite a tough course anyway. And then switched to economics. So it was a good growing up experience. I did lots of things, but without the kind of single-mindedness that produces success as a student.
And you tried to become an MP 4 times before being elected in 1997. What gave you so much determination to become an MP after being defeated 4 times?
Well, I think probably the crucial period when my stamina was really tested was in the mid 80s, because I had stood, I was part of the wave that produced the Social Democratic Party, later part of the Lib Dems, the breakaway from the Labour Party, and we were very idealistic and very optimistic. And I stood for York in 1983, expecting, a good chance of winning. Didn't happen. Going for it a second time in 1987 was quite demoralizing because we were going downhill. It wasn't leading anywhere as a political movement. So I think the crucial question was, how did I manage to keep going after 1987? I had personal difficulties at home. My wife Olympia had got cancer by that stage. I was spending a lot of time caring for her. I'd also got a very demanding high-level job in Shell. I eventually became their chief economist. So that, keeping going at that stage was a bit sort of perverse. I think it was that having spent so much time and effort, I didn't just want to give up. And Olympia gave me a lot of encouragement. She just said, look, you've spent a large chunk of your life doing this. Don't give up now. And there was a vacancy opened up in Twickenham where I happened to live. The Lib Dem candidate, they'd eventually given up. It seemed pretty hopeless. We were down to, I think, 2% in the opinion polls or something. But it was, my own home area. It didn't involve any travel. It seemed a relatively low risk, low cost option. So I did stand as a Lib Dem in Twickenham in 92. We did well, but lost. And keeping going for the next 5 years with Olympia's health deteriorating, the pressures of work was hard going, but I guess it was Olympia's encouragement as much as anything else that kept me going.
So in the 2000s, you were one of the contributors to the so-called Orange Book. Now, do you think the days of the Orange Book and its policies are over?
Yes, I think in a word. It was certainly relevant at the time because the Lib Dems were doing well actually at that point. We picked up a lot of support on the back of the objections to the Iraq War. Charles Kennedy was a leader, very popular. But there was the Lib Dems were in a very strange position. They were somehow trying to overtake the Labour Party on the left, which was bizarre and implausible. And there were those of us who, were liberal in an economic sense as well as a social sense, but also had a social democratic instinct who wanted to, rebalance the arguments within the party in terms of greater economic realism. I think we probably overdid it in the sense that the push to more liberal economic policies is not, frankly, not something that there's an appetite for at the moment. But in the context which I've described to you, I think it did make a certain amount of sense, and it helped to make us more credible in the run-up to the 2010 election.
And do you think the Liberal Democrats should have been more vocal about the benefits of being a member of the European Union prior to 2016?
I think so, yes. I think we all share some responsibility for the failure to carry public opinion over Europe. I think we were less culpable than the Conservative leadership, people like Cameron, who were constantly using the European Union as an excuse for policy failures. But and I think everybody recognised that the Lib Dems were the European party. We supported British membership and European projects at every turn, but we did tend to be a bit apologetic and perhaps throwing a bit more heft behind the European project would have been helpful, particularly in the years when we were in the cabinet.
And you became acting leader in 2007, but you don't become the real leader until you're 74 years of age in 2017. Why did it take you so long, and would you have described yourself as a reluctant leader?
Well, I wasn't reluctant, but it was. It would have been much better if it had happened sooner. I mean, there were little chinks of possibility at the time when Charles Kennedy stepped down, but there was a natural replacement in the form of Ming Campbell, and I sort of got behind that rather than fought for myself. And then when he left, I would have stood and probably would have done well, actually. I had a very good kind of public profile at that time. But it turned out that Nick Clegg and Chris Huhne had already been organising for the previous year, pretty much. They'd tied up all their endorsements. Most of my parliamentary colleagues were already committed to them, so there was no way of breaking through. So I just tried to make the best of being an acting leader and did, I think, quite a good job. That was the time if I had really wanted to make a big success of the job, that was the time to do it, but the opening was not there.
And what do you think your biggest achievements as leader were?
Well, we did turn the party round, actually. I mean, after 2010, as soon as we joined into the coalition, the party's support collapsed in public opinion terms, even before controversial issues like tuition fees surfaced. We'd gone down from 20 to 5% or something. I mean, it was awful. And it remained at very low levels, I think averaging about 7% aggregate, pretty much from 2010 until the time I took over as leader. We had the awful election in 2015. It didn't get much better in 2017. So my job was to try to rebuild. And I did this in two ways. One was by concentrating on local government and rebuilding the local government base. We were very successful at that in two local elections. The latter, I think, was the best local election results the party had ever had. And the other was to have us firmly committed to being the party of the referendum, the people's vote, the clearly pro-European party at the time of Brexit. And I think, again, we succeeded, did extremely well in the European elections before I stepped down. So I did two things, two thrusts, both of which worked. And by the time I retired, which was July, the party was in a pretty good shape.
And what do you wish you'd have done differently?
Well, it's difficult with hindsight. I think, like a lot of party leaders and the Lib Dems, it's very difficult to avoid being sucked into a lot of energy-sapping, inward-looking organizational issues within the party. I mean, politics, you don't see this from the outside, but it tends to be very incestuous. You spend a lot of time trying to diffuse quarrels, managing obscure committees and difficult personalities. And I think if I had really looked outward the whole time rather than allowed myself to be dragged into more inward-looking controversies, that would have been better. Otherwise, I think I did as well as I could with the rather poor hand that I had to play with.
And I want to get your analysis on the failure of the second referendum. Do you think it was doomed from the start, or do you think that there was a road in which the Liberal Democrats, among others, could have followed to achieve it?
No, I don't think it was doomed from the start. It was going to be very difficult. I mean, I started off as a skeptic about the second referendum. I didn't think it was a good tactic in the 2017 election because we just had one referendum. People were being basically told that the result didn't mean anything. I didn't think that was a very good political positioning. But what changed things was Theresa May's Lancaster House speech, when she walked away from potential compromise solutions. Well, we could have stayed in the European Economic Area, we could have stayed in the customs union, the single market, and left the kind of political structures. And I think that's the kind of compromise that the British public would have been contented with and would have, ticked a lot of boxes. But she walked away from it. We were facing a much more extreme outturn, and I think it was important to fight. And so when I got back into Parliament and became party leader, taking up the cause of the people's vote seemed absolutely the right thing to do. There was a lot of support for it, and you remember the big marches, and that was reflected to some extent in public opinion. There was a potential coalition of Labour, Lib Dem, Green, some Conservatives who could have just about made it happen. I mean, in the event, the critical problem was Jeremy Corbyn, who didn't want to go there. He had his own ideological considerations, and he had a group of backbenchers who wouldn't entertain the idea anyway. And that made it extremely difficult. I think when we got to the end point, at the end of 2019, it was just possible that if the opposition parties had played their cards right, it might have happened. But in the event, I think mistakenly, the Lib Dems joined forces with the SNP to precipitate an early election. I didn't think that was a good policy. And also, I think wrongly, we changed the policy to one of revoke, which alienated a lot of people and threw away all the goodwill that had been built up through the referendum campaign. So it was going to be difficult, but it was just about possible if we'd been consistent.
I want to talk a bit more about that. So, yeah, like you say, the policy switched to a revoke position. Now, can you give us your assessment of Jo Swinson's leadership?
Well, she had a lot of, positive qualities. I supported her coming into the leadership. She was fresh, articulate, intelligent, personable. There was a strong feeling in the party that we should have a woman leader. And obviously, she was. Things went wrong. Now, how much was Jo and how much were the people around her, as I rather think was the case, it's not for me to adjudicate. I'd stepped aside and let her get on with it. I mean, it's very clear that the things which did for us in the 2019 election were to some extent beyond our control. I mean, there was a lot of potential Remainer supporters, people who normally voted Conservative but wanted to remain in the European Union, who would have voted for us but were so alarmed at the prospect of Jeremy Corbyn and Labour getting into power that they stuck with the Tories, and that cost us quite a lot of seats. The places like Winchester, Guildford, Wimbledon that might otherwise have gone to us. So the other problem we had, of course, was that the Tories were completely united, having thrown out all of the Remainers. They were, the hardline Brexit party. They were very clear, whereas the Remainers were fragmented, and we had this, division between Lib Dems and Labour. Lib Dems, we had struck up an alliance with the Greens, something I had helped to forge. But the division with Labour proved rather fatal.
And do you think it was a mistake not trying to work with Jeremy Corbyn in the Labour Party, or do you always think that was unworkable?
Well, we did try to work with the Labour Party, and we did try to work with Jeremy Corbyn, but recognising that he was politically toxic from the point of view of a lot of voters, and there was the kind of whole anti-Semitism issue in the background. And what I had concentrated on in my period as leaders was trying to bring across some of the Labour defectors, and Chukwuemeka was the one I knew best, and indeed come across when I was still the leader. So we were working with Labour rebels rather than with the Labour leadership, but certainly on tactical issues in Parliament, we had good relations with Keir Starmer and like-minded people to try and get good results in Parliament. But the Corbyn leadership proved to be an impossible obstacle. And we've now seen with what's happening in the Labour Party that their legacy was so malign that it's difficult to see how anybody else could have done better working with them.
And do you think going forward, a progressive alliance of the Labour Party, the Liberal Democrats, the Scottish Nationalists is the only option in order to defeat the Conservatives?
Well, the Scottish Nationalists are a problem in that combination. I think in Scotland itself, that is the big issue, is around nationalism rather than other divisions. And we're a unionist party. We're in favour of Scottish Home Rule. The Lib Dems pioneered a lot of the devolution of powers to the Scottish Parliament, but we're not in favour of breaking up the UK. So there's no way that our Lib Dems in Scotland are going to work with the SNP. Moreover, if we did, it would alienate a lot of our voters in England. And that was one of the reasons why we lost a lot of seats in 2015, because the Tories put around this canard that you're going to get a Labour government working with the SNP propped up by the Lib Dems. And it was completely false, but it frightened a lot of voters, and they were very successful. No, we couldn't have an alliance with the SNP. I think with Labour, I think we should work with them. There is a complementarity of interests. There are parts of the country where Lib Dems are clearly the main opposition to the Tories. There are regrettably not as many places as there was 10 years ago, but quite a lot. We could deliver 30 to 40 seats, I guess, with tactical voting and the right kind of campaign. And that could complement a Labour under Starmer and good leadership and sensible policies, if that's what they finish up with. So I can see a loose understanding, not necessarily a formal pact with the Labour Party, and that could be the factor that changes the government.
We'll go back a few years. So we'll talk about the coalition years. What's your assessment of Nick Clegg's leadership? What did he do well and what did he get wrong?
Well, what he did well, of course, was getting us to a point where we were credible partners in government. And he was a likable personality, a good team leader. I mean, those were the things I saw as one of his colleagues. But he did, I think, perhaps understandably, we'd never been in this position before, but I think he had a somewhat sort of European view of coalitions, that people actually liked the idea of coalitions, and we discovered they didn't, and that the Labour people portrayed it as terrible betrayal. The Tories sought to exploit it for their own advantage. So I think a more hard-nosed, aggressive presence within the coalition, assuming we could have continued to maintain it, would have been the right approach. I tried to do that in a small way in my own capacity, but I think in a way Nick was too nice for the coalition situation.
And what was your feeling in 2010? Were you in favour of it? Did you think it was a necessary thing?
I went along with it. Yes, I did vote for it. I supported it. My own preference would have been to have had a coalition with Gordon Brown, the Labour Party. I worked quite hard with Gordon Brown to try and deliver that, but there weren't the votes in Parliament. We added up the numbers, that we were just short of people to make it happen. And there were a lot of people in the Labour leadership, the new generation, the Miliband, Zed Balls, who were just not interested. So it just wasn't feasible. And we took the view that in a national emergency, which is what we felt was the case with the economy, we would not have been forgiven if we just walked away and let the country drift under minority government.
And what was it like to lose your seat in 2015? Was it a shock?
Well, it was pretty awful. I mean, what I found reassuring at the time, and the reason, therefore, why I hung in there, was a lot of people were saying on the doorsteps, well, we're happy to vote for you as the local MP, but we're pretty appalled at the prospect of a Labour SNP government with you lot propping it up. So I'm sorry, we're going to go back to our Conservative alliances. So that was really what did for us. There were some former Labour Green voters who had voted for me before, but were disillusioned with the coalition. But that wasn't the key factor. The key factor was the defection of a large number of previously Conservative voters who had supported me in 2010, and they were happy to support me as a local MP. And then when I stood again 2 years later, all that support came flooding back.
And counterfactuals they're basically impossible, but if you'd have led the party into the 2019 election, do you think it would have been a different outcome?
It's possible. I like to think it would have been better, but I don't think I would have been able to overcome the fundamental problems that we discussed a few minutes ago. I would have still had to face the argument about, isn't there a danger of letting in Corbyn amongst a lot of middle of the road Tory-leaning Remainers? That would have been there. The argument about let's Brexit done was totally dishonest, of course, but a lot of people bought it. And certainly in north of England constituencies, the southwest of England, which were Brexity in the jargon, we would have struggled there. So yeah, I think there were some of the mistakes I could perhaps have avoided, and I had some positive things to bring to bear. It may have made a bit of difference, but not turned the whole situation around radically.
So we spoke about the past a lot. We'll move on to the present and the future. So what do you want to see as the political and economic response to the coronavirus? Do you think the age of austerity, that an austerity response is implausible?
Well, I think the government has actually done pretty much the right thing so far, like other Western governments, the Germans, the United States, US Congress, and even Trump, the Chinese, the Japanese. I mean, all major governments have quite unexpectedly and dramatically pursued very expansionary fiscal policies alongside easy money policies to try and cushion the effects of the virus. And that's absolutely right. And I think, the British government has stood out as being exceptionally good on economic issues. I do worry for the future. I get a sense that they're beginning to panic over the size of borrowing. They are large numbers, but it's got to happen. Britain could almost certainly sustain significantly higher public debt levels for several years. Interest rates are low. Confidence is quite high in the UK. If they took a sort of 10, 15-year view about getting back to deficit and debt sustainability, that would be fine. The danger is that they will now panic, and that as soon as we seem to be coming out of the pandemic, they'll slam on the brakes. We'll have a combination of higher taxes, we do need higher taxes, and cuts in spending that would be premature and quite damaging. But I don't want to judge them prematurely. It hasn't happened yet.
And you've written about the dangers of going left in the Liberal Democratic Party, and what do you see as the tendency that's driving this leftward shift, and who are you going to back for the new leader?
Well, I haven't publicly backed either of the two candidates, and I've told both of them I've no intention of doing so. When we talk about moving left, I mean, there are some respects in which, I'd be perfectly happy for us to move to the left, and indeed more progressive taxation will be part of it. What I don't think is sensible is to do what we were trying to do 15 years ago, which is to outflank the Labour Party on that. There are a few people, I don't think many, who are saying that because Keir Starmer is, a moderate centrist, so, supposedly, and is ditching the Corbyn legacy, we should try to move in and snap up all the disillusioned Corbynites. That strikes me as completely mad. And, nobody would take that seriously. So when I've cautioned against trying to move to the left of Labour, that's what I'm referring to. I'm not opposed to. I mean, there's got to be more progressive taxation. There will be much more emphasis on public sector driving the economy and the kind of interventionist industrial strategy that I helped to create when I was in the coalition. So I'm not afraid of that. It's the outlier approach that I'm nervous about.
And you know Ed Davey and Layla Moran well? And if so,
Yes.
could you tell us a bit about their qualities?
Well, I know Ed Davey very well. He was been my next door neighbour as an MP for over 20 years and was a colleague in the government. And he's a very highly competent guy, very knowledgeable on economic issues, thoughtful, kind of sensible. I don't want to, damn him with faint praise, but, the idea of being experienced, sensible, middle of the road, I think those are compliments, they're not criticisms. Layla I know less well, but she was a colleague for over 5 years and is very sparky, insightful, good listener, and fresh and new. I mean, I personally am quite proud of the contribution we made in the coalition, but she wasn't part of that era. And if you're wanting somebody who is detached from it, then she fulfills that role.
And what have you made of Sir Keir Starmer's leadership?
Well, I think so far, I think that most people impressed. I mean, I saw the guy in action when I was in Parliament, and he was very competent and articulate, what you'd expect of a top-class legal brain. And he seemed good at managing relationships. No, I think, as far as I can see, he hasn't done anything wrong so far. He hasn't yet got to the difficult bit, which is how to ditch a lot of the policies which Corbyn had, which were superficially popular. Spending lots of money, everything free. That kind of thing did have a certain superficial appeal, and at some point he's going to have to turn his back on it, and we'll wait and see what happens then.
And what do you see occurring at the end of the year? Because, of course, we've got the looming deadline on the 31st of December. What do you see is happening in that respect?
Well, I had assumed hitherto that the government would be sensible enough to get some kind of, not a deal, but some way of heading off the worst of a disruptive no deal. In other words, to avoid the scenario of long queues at Dover and planes not being able to take off because we hadn't got an agreement on air traffic standards. And I suppose I still expect that they will, behind the scenes, they are trying to compromise. But all the mood music we're getting out of government suggests that they are, heading for a brick wall. I don't know who to believe, to be frank. I kind of my sort of instincts are that they will settle for something, and with the end of year will come and go without great drama. But there are so many headbangers in the cabinet that it's possible that we could be in for a very bad time indeed. I've always believed that the real damage from leaving the European Union will be cumulative rather than a spectacular kind of fireworks display at the end of the year. But who knows?
And the formal process of Brexit's now over. We've officially left. So what role do the Liberal Democrats play in British politics today?
Well, as I described earlier, I think in a complementary role to the Labour Party. I think people will be pretty desperate for a change of government at the end of this period if they perform the way they are now. And it can only happen through a combination of Labour and Lib Dem, certainly in England. So there is an important role for us. There's an extremely important role for us in local government, where Lib Dems have traditionally had a major role running major cities as well as suburbs and rural areas. We've got, very good at local government, done it very well, and I would like to see us recolonizing local government. And also been willing to take up, radical positions where the Labour Party feels that in order not to alienate the public, they should avoid being too radical. I mean, the tax is going to be an issue where somebody's going to have to say controversial things about taxing property values, for example, which the Labour Party may not want to go down. And we have a role in that area, I think. So yes, I think the Lib Dems do have a future. It's going to be difficult in the next 2 or 3 years, but I think come the next general election, we'll be still competitive in many parts of the country.
And the Corbyn administration was popular for its Green New Deal policy. So what action would you like to be taken on climate change?
Well, the Green New Deal slogan is something we all use, but I think different people mean different things by it. I mean, when we were in government, Ed Davey was Secretary of State at the time, we had a Green Deal. I mean, it didn't work because people didn't rush out and want to insulate their homes, but there was a program to help them do it. Quite how we're going to overcome that kind of inertia in practice, I'm not quite sure. It's a practical problem, not an issue of slogans. And one of the things I did was establish and then oversee the Green Investment Bank. That was a great success. And if you're talking about a Green New Deal, would be absolutely central to its future. But of course, the Tories sold it off. It would have to be re-established. And these things are not easy. So I think a combination of that kind of energy conservation program that we had in coalition, but on a much bigger scale, a green investment bank again on a much bigger scale, recalibrating the industrial strategy so there's much more of a focus on low carbon futures in, say, the car industry and aerospace industry. I mean, those are the elements that need to happen. But I think there's an awful lot of glib talk about, Green New Deals. I mean, it's actually when you confront the public with difficult choices, they often don't give you the answer you want. I mean, as Macron discovered with his carbon tax, once it becomes expensive, people start reacting against it. And one of the early problems we're going to encounter is that because public transport has been really hammered by this COVID crisis, people have gone back to using motor cars. Now, if you're interested in a sustainable future, that's all got to be reversed. I mean, cycling's okay, and I do a lot of it, but you can't cycle 200 miles. You need trains, and people have got to rebuild their confidence in public transport. It's not going to be easy.
And we'll talk about the geopolitical threats. So how serious is the Russia threat, and what should they do about it?
It's not a threat to our security, but it is, there has clearly been gross interference with our internal affairs, and the report that was published last week did, I think, somewhat gloss over some of the detailed events that was happening. It's fairly obvious that the Russians were actively involved in trying to manipulate the referendum, the Euro referendum. And the report hardly referred to it. So that kind of activity is there, and it's going to continue. We've had these appalling episodes like the poisonings, and that's the kind of things that the Russian government does. But I don't see it. It's not like in the Cold War days, where you have two nuclear armed powers confronting each other, and us as part of the NATO alliance with very real risks of conflict breaking out. It's a much more diffuse threat. And of course, we have to recognize that Russia is not a great power anymore. So it's considerably weakened. It has a very weak economy, highly dependent on oil, which has much less value. We've got some very clever KGB operators led by Putin, and they're crooks. It is a kind of mafia state, and it can cause damage. But as a major security threat, no, I wouldn't say so.
And then we'll talk about China. Now, how dangerous do you think the rhetoric around a new Cold War with China, how dangerous is that, do you think?
I think it's very dangerous, and it's been inflamed to an unnecessary degree. I mean, there are real issues around China, as we've long known, and they are assertive around their borders. We have a president who is much more inclined to beat a nationalistic drum than his more discreet predecessors. And there are particular, human rights abuses that you would expect people who believe in liberal democracy to say something about. But I really don't share the paranoia about China that is so fashionable today. I think we're in very great danger of missing the central point about China, that it is now the big economic superpower. It's overtaken the United States already. We have to have a relationship with them, not just for materialistic reasons, but if you're wanting a global agreement on climate change or getting in a common approach to dealing with debt in Africa, you have to work as partners with the Chinese, and that's not easy, but it has to be done. And I think the virtue signaling and finger wagging we're getting at the moment is, I find, very unhelpful. And it's coming from the Labour Party, from my own party, as well as from the government.
I appreciate you're really busy, so I'll finish with this one. What's the future going to look like for you personally?
Well, I don't see myself as retired. I'm continuing to write a great deal. I feel very frustrated that I can't get around the country. I mean, I used to do a lot of work working with local parties and speaking at party events, doing book festivals, and that's ruled out because of the COVID pandemic. But I would hope that next year we're back to something like normal, and I will be getting back to a range of activities. I have a visiting professorship at the LSE, which I love doing. I want to do more on. I've got a big book lined up. I've got newspaper commitments, so it's more than enough to keep me busy. And I'm, very happy in my personal life. And lovely wife, lovely place to live. So I'm optimistic, and I've got at least, I hope, another decade in front of me to do useful stuff.
Okay, Vince Cable, thanks for your time.
Thank you.